Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about part 6 of An Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley that I'm calling Eric Birling's Interrogation. So you need to have read, watched or studied this part of the play, and you are using this video for revision purposes or to gain a better understanding. I'll start by exploring what happens and then looking at the key character, theme, context and quotes you may wish to memorise for this part of the play, and I will leave you with an exam style question that you can answer if you want to get some writing practice in. So, what happens in part 6, Eric Birling's Interrogation? Remember the play is in 3 acts. I'm just subdividing it into parts for easier analysis. And Eric Birling's Interrogation starts at the beginning of Act 3, so from where it says Act 3, all the way up until when Inspector Goole says stop. So what happens in this section? Well, Act 3 opens on the exact same scene as the end of Act 2. Eric has just entered the stage, and now the curtains go up and we see his interrogation. Eric immediately admits to being involved with Eva Smith, and when Inspector Goole asks him to recount what happens, he goes and pours himself a drink. Initially Mr. Birling refuses, but then Inspector Goole says let the boy have a drink, and we see by the way Eric holds the decanter and drinks the whiskey that yes, he is an alcoholic, he is familiar with heavy drinking. Inspector Goole then starts to interrogate Eric for the details of his encounters with Eva Smith. We learn that Eric was out in the Palace Bar, which is the same place where Gerald Croft picked up Eva Smith. It was a place that was often frequented by the town's prostitutes. And Eric admits he was a bit squiffy. Squiffy is an archaic, an old term for drunk. Eric met Eva and bought her a few drinks. Eric then went back to Eva's and forced himself into her room. We know this because Eric admits that she didn't want him to go in, but he was in a state where a chap easily turns nasty, and he threatened to make a row, an argument, if she didn't let him in. They had sex, though Eric doesn't even remember it, and he says that's a hellish thing, he couldn't remember it. I used the term sex. I think you could also use the term rape. Eva didn't want Eric to go into her room. He forced his way in and into a sexual encounter, so I think you could be justified to say that Eric raped Eva. It's at this point Sheila and Mrs. Birling leave the room. Mr. Birling asks them both to, and they both obey and they go out. And this is an example of gender roles, of the perception that females were more delicate than males, or more susceptible to being hysterical, so they wouldn't be able to handle this sensitive information, and so Sheila and Mrs. Birling were sent out of the room and only the men were left to talk about the disgusting details. But in my opinion, the irony is these disgusting details happened to a woman, happened to Eva Smith. So there's a clear difference, not just in the way men treat women in this era, but in the way a working class woman and an upper class woman would be treated. Eric then continues his story of his interactions with Eva, and he says they met a fortnight later, again at the Palace Bar, and the events replayed themselves. They had some drinks, they went back, but this time he was less drunk, and they actually had a conversation and got to know each other a little bit. And it was a little bit later that she, as in Eva Smith, told Eric that she believed she was pregnant, and then she confirmed it. She said yes, she was definitely pregnant. So to support Eva Smith, Eric admits that he stole £50 from Birling & Co., which is his father's company, to support Eva. In our modern day society, £50 does not sound like a lot, but back in Edwardian England it was a significant sum of money. Sheila and Mrs. Birling at this point return to the room, and they say that their curiosity basically got the better of them. They want to find out what happened. And Mr. Birling catches them up. He says that Eric is responsible for getting Eva Smith pregnant, and Eric is also responsible for stealing money from the company. And both Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling seem more concerned that Eric stole money than the fact that he got a girl pregnant and now Eva Smith has committed suicide and she and the child are dead. This is a real criticism of capitalism from J.B. Priestley, in my point of view, that the capitalist characters in our story, Mr. and Mrs. Birling, value money, £50, over the life of a human and the life of a baby. It's at this point Eric reveals that Mr. Birling is not a supportive father. He says, "You're not the kind of father a chap can go to when he's in trouble." Inspector Gould then reveals to Eric that Mrs. Birling was the last to see Eva Smith and refused to give her help from her charitable organisation. I would use charitable in sarcastic quote marks. Eric then blames his mother for killing his child and her grandchild, and he really doesn't hold back. "You killed her and the child she'd have had too, my child, your own grandchild, you killed them both, damn you, damn you." Sorts of dashes in this quote, which we will look at later. Eric then reveals that Mrs. Birling is not a supportive mother. "You don't understand anything, you never did, you never even tried." I've had this debate with students in class. Would you rather have parents who were super rich, like Mr. and Mrs. Birling, but who didn't understand you, or didn't take time to develop a relationship with you? Or would you rather have parents who maybe weren't rich, but had time to invest in you? And despite reading an Inspector Calls, and despite knowing what happens between Mr. Birling, Mrs. Birling and Eric, most of my students still prefer to have rich parents, which I do not understand. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this book, is that I'm really grateful that I do have a supportive father and mother. And I wish Eric had the same, because maybe he wouldn't have done the despicable actions he has if he had a bit more support. The Birlings start bickering, and then Inspector Gould tells them to stop. And that is the end of this section of Act 3, Eric Birling's interrogation. So let's focus on the main character of this section, which is Eric Birling himself. Now, take your minds back to Eric in part 1, that I call Sheila and Gerald's engagement. The stage directions, the opening stage directions, describe Eric as an uneasy character, and he's neither shy nor assertive. The exact phrase is half shy, half assertive. He's basically grown up in his father's shadow, and he's never really lived up to expectations. And as a result, he's passive in areas of life, but then he takes that out by being overly aggressive in other areas of life where he can assert some authority. In part 6, Eric's interrogation, I think Priestley's presenting him as vile yet caring. There's a certain amount of contrast in there. Let me explain. The way Eric behaves, I think most people can agree, is vile, in terms of his alcoholism, in terms of how he forces himself and rapes Eva Smith. I think we can all agree these are vile, disgusting actions. But underneath that, there is a man who cares. He cares for Eva Smith. He admits he didn't love her, but he cares for her and her situation, and he does take responsibility for his actions, because he tries to fix this through supporting her with money, through stealing, through thievery from his father's company. Now again, this is a vile yet caring act. Being a thief is a crime, stealing is a crime, it's a vile act. Yet he's doing it out of a caring heart to support someone. So I think there's definitely this conflict going on in Eric. And he's absolutely outraged at his mother for not offering charitable support to Eva Smith. So again, the outrage, the display of passion, shows he cared about Eva Smith. He cared about his unborn child. He cares about doing the right thing. But his actions are ultimately quite vile. And I would argue maybe they're born out of a lack of support or from living in his father's shadow, that when he does get some power over the working class woman that is Eva Smith, he asserts his authority in a negative, a destructive way, and then he feels upset about it because he does care, he does have a heart, and he can't sort his actions out and redeem the situation. That's my interpretation of Eric Birling. I want to link this to the theme of guilt. First thing I'd want to say is that guilt and responsibility are closely linked. If you take responsibility for your actions, You might feel guilty, and that might inspire you to change. If you don't take responsibility for your actions, it's unlikely you feel guilty, it's unlikely you will change. And here we could link this to another theme, the theme of older generation versus younger generation. It's quite clear that Mr. and Mrs. Birling refuse to accept responsibility. They use quotations and phrases such as "I accept no responsibility" to prove this, or "I cannot accept any responsibility." And as a result, they lack guilt over how their actions have affected Eva Smith. If anything, they seem to care more about their reputation and a scandal, and more about this £50 that Eric stole, than they do about another human life and the life of an unborn baby. Sheila and Eric, on the other hand, do accept responsibility for their actions towards Eva Smith, and as a result do feel guilty over what they've done, and importantly show a desire to change. And it's this desire to change, in my opinion, this is the main message of An Inspector Calls, the main thing that J.B. Priestley wants his post-war British audience to take away with them, a desire to overcome classism, sexism, a desire to shape a more positive, a more equal, a more socialist Britain. Gerald, once again, is kind of in the middle. He doesn't say that he doesn't accept responsibility. He doesn't say that he does accept responsibility. He doesn't appear completely guilt-ridden. He does say he's affected by it more than he lets on. He also doesn't appear completely carefree about the situation. He does say he needs to go on a walk to sort of process his thoughts about Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as he knew her as, being dead. But he spends most of that walk trying to prove that the inspector isn't real. So, how guilty is Gerald? I'm not sure. I think he's somewhere in the middle. He's a bit iffy when it comes to this theme. I've already mentioned that guilt and responsibility closely link, so I pose to you the question, which Birling should bear the most guilt and why? Should it be Arthur Birling for firing Eva and setting off this chain of events? Should it be Sheila Birling for getting Eva Smith fired? Should it be Mrs. Birling for refusing her charitable help? Or should it be Eric Birling for raping her? Who bears the most guilt and why? Some historical context for you. Prostitution in Edwardian England, unfortunately, was a common situation for a working class woman to end up in prostitution and working as a prostitute. So for a working class woman to be deemed socially acceptable, she would need to either A, work, B, get married, or C, have children, or ideally a combination of all three. However, if you combine some of them without others, you can end up in more trouble. For example, if you have children and you weren't married, that would be deemed sort of very unethical, unmoral, unchristian, and people and society would judge you even more harshly for that. But then there's complications. If you get pregnant and you have children, you may not be able to work because you need to raise the children. And therefore you would rely on your husband to support you. But if he is also working a low-paid, unskilled job, maybe he would not be able to do that. So then who looks after the children? And then there's all sorts of complications. It was a really tough life being a working-class woman in the Edwardian era. Now, if a working-class woman did not possess these qualities, they did not have a job, or maybe they weren't married, or maybe they had children but out of wedlock, they were ostracised by society. They were isolated and rejected by society. And quite often, unmarried or unemployed women, or maybe women who had children outside of wedlock, would be forced into prostitution to support themselves and maybe any children they had. And in the act of being a prostitute, they exposed themselves to greater pregnancy, which meant that some of them used what you would call backstreet abortions, sort of like illegal abortion clinics, which were very unhygienic, very dangerous, I imagine very traumatic and very damaging. So it really was a tough life. Students have asked me this before, did they have condoms in the Edwardian era? I assume so. Condoms were invented before then, but I imagine they were quite expensive and perhaps maybe unreliable. But maybe that's something you can ask your history teacher, who might have a better knowledge of the history of condoms than I do. What would happen in this situation is upper class men would exploit the vulnerability of these women in particular. In particular, if they had some kind of relationship with the woman. So, for example, if the working class woman was a servant in their house, maybe a kitchen maid, they might exploit this situation sexually. And then let's say that kitchen maid becomes pregnant with the child of the master of the house, one of the young men of the house. Her only hope would be for that young man to marry her. But realistically, he wouldn't want to do this, and society would frown upon this because of the class gap, upper class and working class. And as a result, the kitchen maid, for example, would have to keep her pregnancy a secret in order to keep her job. Otherwise, the master of the house would have her fired. And now suddenly she is a woman who has a child out of wedlock, and society's ostracised her. When the child comes along, if she's not able to work in the kitchen anymore and look after the child, she might lose her job anyway. So she's out on the street, she's unemployed, she has a child out of wedlock, she may be forced into prostitution, there may be backstreet abortions, there may be all sorts of complications, disease, horrible ways that the men treat women. And unfortunately, this was a really sad reality in the Edwardian era. And I'm sure it's still a sad reality in society today. It's a problem that society is yet to fix. So, what quotes can we look at from this section of the play? Besides, you're not the type. Mrs. Birling says this. She's saying this to Eric. You're not the type of person who gets drunk. You're not the type of person who would rape a girl and get a working class girl pregnant. I would zoom in on the word type. Mrs. Birling is so fixated by types of people, sorts of people, that you could link to the theme of class. She's so classist. She thinks that just because her son is upper class, he's morally right. He wouldn't be an alcoholic. He wouldn't be a rapist. And yet he is. And just because Eva Smith is of working class, that she wouldn't be able to feel complicated emotions like love, that she wouldn't be able to reject money because she has no morals, which of course we know she does reject the money. She is able to feel fine feelings like love. I was a bit squiffy. Eric says this. I would look at the adjective squiffy. It's archaic. It's an old term for sort of drunk or tipsy. I was in that state when a chap easily turns nasty. I think this is a more accurate description of Eric as a drunk. That adjective nasty, and the way he treats Eva Smith and forces himself on her and effectively rapes her, I think is safe to say is nasty. That's the hellish thing. Here Eric is saying the hellish thing is that he can't remember what he did to Eva Smith. But I would probably argue from Eva Smith's point of view, the hellish thing was the actual sexual act he did commit. I'd also look at this word hellish, and I'd link it to this idea of morality, particularly Christian morality. In the Edwardian era, Christianity was the dominant religion in Great Britain, and this idea of doing things that were morally right. And I think what Eric's done here is definitely morally and biblically wrong. £50, that's the sum of money Eric stole from Birling and Co. Both Eric says it and Mr. Birling says it, so you can decide who you want to quote here depending on your answer that you're writing. He was responsible for the girl's condition he stole from the office. Mr. Birling says this when Sheila and Mrs. Birling re-enter the scene to sort of catch them up. You've got that keyword responsible that you could link to the theme of responsibility, but I also kind of find the word condition interesting. Normally when you talk of a condition, you talk of like a medical condition, maybe leprosy or cancer or some sort of complex medical condition. Here Eric has got Eva Smith pregnant, so why doesn't Mr. Birling just say the word pregnant? I think by using the word condition it sort of makes it more of a disgusting act in a way, more of a vile act. Maybe it's sort of a kind of detachment. Mr. Birling's trying to detach himself from the reality of the situation. I don't know, I find that word quite interesting. And he stole from the office. Now remember, square brackets with an ellipsis means I'm taking the same quote or the same speech, just later on. I'm leaving out a bit in the middle. And here I'd say that Mr. Birling is more focused on the stolen money than he is on Eva Smith being pregnant and currently dead. Because you're not the kind of father a chap could go to when he's in trouble. That's why. Eric says this quote, and it's a great quote to show that on the surface, even though your family might be capitalistic and rich and wealthy, it doesn't mean you're morally right, or you're a close-knit family, or you're supportive, or you're a healthy family, or you produce healthy children. It's this idea of a facade, having an upper-class front. Oh, look at us in our fancy house with our fancy cars and our big wedding rings. Whereas actually, if you peel behind the mask of upper-classness, maybe there are rotten people, a bit like Eric with vile hearts who can do unspeakable acts, or a bit like Gerald who would cheat on his fiancée, or a bit like Mr. Birling who cares more about money than he does about humanity, or a bit like Mrs. Birling who is incredibly judgy of people. Actually that fake front of, ooh, I'm rich and life is perfect, might not be true. Inside there might be a rotten core of a human. And I think this is one of the points that J.B. Priestley is trying to get across. You'll be able to divide the responsibility between you when I've gone. Inspector Gould says this, and again there's that keyword responsibility. And if you look back to the video I made on an Inspector Calls Part 2, I explained in the theme of responsibility there's two types of responsibility. There's personal responsibility and social responsibility. And this quote is great because it talks about dividing responsibility. So that means dividing the social responsibility into personal responsibility. And there's lots you can analyse and unpack from this quote thematically about responsibility. You killed her. And the child she'd have had too, my child, your own grandchild. You killed them both. Damn you, damn you. Eric says this. Apologies for there being a stray speech mark in the middle of the quote. But Eric says all of that. And all of the dashes here sort of show how angry he is. He can't form a full sentence from beginning to end. We get these fragments of sentences, fragments of anger. I'd look at the verb killed that he's repeated. I might also look at the repetition of damn you, damn you. Eric uses a lot of words associated with hell. He says that hellish thing. He uses hell again later, and now he uses damn you. The phrase damn you means to damn someone to hell, to send them to damnation. So he's sending his mother, Mrs. Birling, Sybil, to hell for her actions. He's saying, go to hell, you belong in hell for what you've done. Now, a bit later on in the next video, actually, we'll look at Inspector Gould, and he also talks about a hellish landscape of hellish consequences for what you do if you don't treat people with respect and you don't help those who need help. So I think it's really important contextually to understand that Edwardian Britain was Christian, and this idea of morality and heaven and hell were important concepts to society at the time. Eric then says, you don't understand anything. He directs this to his mother, Mrs. Birling. You don't understand anything, you never did, you never even tried. So again, going back to this idea that Mrs. Birling likes to present with her fancy dress and her expensive earrings and necklace. She wants to present that she's got everything under control, that she's a perfect mother with a perfect son who isn't an alcoholic, who isn't a rapist, and their lives are perfect. But in reality, she has no love there. She's cold. And as a result, Eric has never had that support. He feels undermined. And when he does go and assert his authority, he does it in really destructive, damaging ways. So, what can you do? You can make a note from this video on a physical copy of the play, and you can answer this exam-style question. A student said, the way Eric treats Eva is the worst out of all of the Birlings. How far do you agree with this statement? So, in your introduction, you may want to introduce how the Birlings treat Eva. Arthur gets her fired, Sheila gets her fired, Eric rapes her, and then Mrs. Birling denies her help. Do you think Eric treats Eva Smith the worst? How far do you agree with that statement? Does anyone else need to take as much blame as Eric, or is Eric by far the standout, most evil Birling in this play? If you like this video, please give it a like. Please consider subscribing to my channel to get the rest of my Anne Spectacles video analysis, and feel free to leave a comment if you think I've left anything out. Well, thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.